Good morning, everybody. We are in the middle of chapter 23 of Shemuel Bet. I'm going to backtrack just a couple of pisukim so that we get into the topic so we're not lost. We're going to start at verse 13, pasuk Yud Gimal. We're in the section that's dealing with the Giborim, the strong warriors of David. We already started a little list, kind of grouping the different warriors into levels and categories, the three strongest, the next three strongest we're going to see, then the 30 plus who, just kind of rank and file after that. And by the end of the chapter, we'll have kind of a visual of how David's army operated and who were some of his significant people. Many of them we're not going to remember or recognize. They're the first time we're seeing them. Some of them we will recall and mention them, and hopefully we'll pick out a couple of ideas that we could take away as we close chapter 23, this epilogue about the Giborim, the warriors of David. In the middle, after mentioning the first top three warriors of David, they were, just going back to verse 8, the first was Adino Ha'etzmi, who also had a name called Yoshev Bashevet Tahkemoni, Rosh Shalishi. So the first was Adino. The second one was Elazar ben Dodo. The third one in verse 11 was Shama ben Ageh. So we had three warriors, none of whom we recognized from any other story prior to this, but they were the top three warriors in David's army. And the text tells us of some crazy things that they did, standing strong against hundreds of Philistine soldiers and taking it upon themselves to fight, and God performing great miracles for them. Now we come to verse 13, which we started reading, but I'm going to reread again, which is a story about three warriors who go out to do a heroic deed for David. Vayeredu shelosha mehashloshim rosh. Vayavo el Ketzir el David el Me'arat Adulam. Once during the Katsir, during the harvest season when it was very hot, 3 of the 30 chiefs went down to David at the cave of Adulam, the Hayat Pilishtim Hone Be'emek HaRefaim, while a force of Philistines were encamped in the valley of Rephaim. We don't know who these 3 warriors were. Were they the warriors part of the previous 3 that we just mentioned? It would seem that not, because then it would have just mentioned this story in conjunction. The fact that this is a new start seems to suggest we're talking about 3 other warriors from among the 30 who are a little bit lower on the totem pole. Verse 14, V'David az b'metzudah, David was then in the stronghold, u'matzav Pilishtim az Bethlehem, and the Philistine garrison was then at Bethlehem, which David knows well. David's from Bethlehem. Excuse me. David got a craving and said, Mi ashkeni mayim, who will bring me water to drink? Or where will I find water to drink? Mibor Bethlehem asher basha'ar, from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gates. So David doesn't command or instruct anybody specifically to go get. He simply lets out a complaint. If only he had water for which to be able to draw from. We mentioned that there's a double layer to this, a metaphor that the rabbis point out that water is Torah, and David had questions that he needed answered, and he was stuck in a precarious position about burning a field and so on. I did not re-explore again that Gemara Baba Batra. I said I would, but I forgot. I apologize. Maybe I'll bring it up again in our next class. But there's both a simple approach here, which is just that David is thirsty and people are going to risk their lives for him. Others say that this was more of a deeper idea, something related to Torah and a question that David needed answers to. And these 3 warriors went and got him the answers from the Bet Din that were in Bethlehem. Verse 16, upon hearing that their king was in need, although he didn't specifically instruct them, these 3 warriors take it upon themselves to put their life on the line on behalf of the king. So the 3 warriors broke through the Philistine camp. Livkoa means to breach, to break through a stronghold. And they indeed drew water from the well at Bethlehem Asher Bashar, which is at the gate. Vayis'u vayavi'u el David, and they carried the water and brought it to David. When David sees the water, he has a peculiar response. Velo aval ishtotam. David would not accept the water. He refused to drink from the water they brought for him. Vayasech otam ladonai, and instead he poured it as a libation to God. Now, why did he do this? Tells us the text in verse 17. Vayomer, David said, Halila li Adonai me'asoti zot. It would, heaven forbid, it would be a desecration for me to do such a thing, meaning to drink from the water which they brought for him. Why? Hadam ha'anashim ha'holchim benafshotam velo aval ishtotam. Can I drink the blood of the men who went at risk of their lives? In other words, David did not ask them to bring the water, but he realized that he made a grave mistake. By complaining out loud without instructing, he put people in a position where they would want to sacrifice their life on behalf of the king. So David realizes that he has to be more mindful or more careful about what he says and the things that he complains about out loud. He didn't realize the power that he had over his people, that the minute they see he's in need, they're willing to sacrifice their life on his behalf. It does not seem as though David was in a life-threatening situation by any means. It just seems as though he was lacking something that he really wanted. And the warriors are so devoted to David that they're willing to sacrifice their life for him just to solve this issue for him. And when David realizes this, he realizes that he put his people in a very precarious position, and thus he refuses to drink the water to reinforce the idea that people should sacrifice for him. In other words, now by using the water in a different way and realizing that he regretted what he had said, people will now not put their lives at danger just simply to fulfill whatever David needs, right? So that's David's reaction to this. He says, Ele asu shloshet hagiborim. Such were the exploits of the three warriors. This is what these three warriors did. Now, again, it's not clear where these three warriors fit in the hierarchy of the warrior system of David, but the text tells us that there's a story. It could be it's the next three warriors we're going to see, or it was the previous three warriors, but the text is somewhat vague. I think in what he's doing, he is appreciated, right? I think his actions, so he doesn't throw it on the floor, he sacrifices it to God, right? He gives the water, in other words, he offered it up to Hashem in some way, whether he built a mizbeach and poured it or something, or he did a korban, it's not clear, but he offered it as a libation to God. The way David looks at this water, he looks at this water as if it's blood. He sees it as the blood of the people who were willing to risk their lives. So he's regretting, and in his regret, I believe he's also showing appreciation. He's recognizing the self-sacrifice of these warriors, but he also realizes that it wasn't necessary for them to be in that situation if not for him. So I don't think it's a lack of appreciation. That's where the offering to God comes in. So he's not just wasting it, but at the same time, he's regretting that he put them in that situation and looks at the water as if it's blood. We see David's sensitivity to his people. He doesn't often even realize how they look at him. He's often unaware, not even mindful of the kind of love and sacrifice that they have for David. Maybe because David's been burnt in the past a little bit from people. It's admirable that they have that relationship with David, but in this context, it goes to a point that in David's mind is too far. Probably not in the warriors. He doesn't critique the warriors at all. David is not upset about what they did. Like I said before, he honors them and offers their water that they bring to Hashem. He realizes how powerful it is. This is all in David's own self-reflection of him saying he put them in a precarious situation that he should not. Yeah, I thought about that as well, which is interesting, right? Could this counteract? Well, it definitely shows a different level of sensitivity towards his soldiers, towards his warriors. He doesn't take what they do for granted. So you see that David did not necessarily treat every warrior the way he treated Uriah. Uriah, he got into a bad spot, as we'll see by his mention at the end of the chapter. But the text here in this epilogue is showing us that David had great sensitivity towards his soldiers and recognized when he put them in difficult positions. Did have an appreciation for them, I think. We move through the list, we continue, and now we go to group 2, the next group of 3 warriors. And some of these we will recognize. Verse 18, Va'avishai achi Yoav ben Seruya. Avishai, who was the brother of Yoav ben Seruya, who we've seen in multiple stories throughout our book. He's the one who went down to the Shaul's camp when he was sleeping and wanted to kill Shaul. We saw Avishai in a number of different situations. In Shimei, when Shimei was cursing him, Avishai wanted to kill Shimei, and David told him no. We see Avishai's hot-headedness, his extremism for protection for David and his loyalty to David, which is ironic considering that his brother Yoav will, in the end of his life, rebel against David. He's had a bit of a back and forth, lukewarm relationship with David as time has gone on. And as we noted, Yoav himself is not mentioned in this list personally. He's only mentioned by way of tangent by mentioning his brother Avishai. We'll come back to that point as well. So Avishai, the brother of Yoav, hu rosh hashlosha, he is the head of this second group of 3 great warriors. Vehu orer et chanito al shlosh me'ot chalal. He once wielded his spear against 300 men, velo shem bashelosha, and he killed them. He has his name amongst this next group of 3. Min hashelosha hachi nechbad, vahi lahem lesar. He won a name among these 3. He was for them, since he was the most highly regarded among the 3, he was their Sar, their commanding officer. Ve'ad hashlosha lo ba. However, he did not attain to the 3. This is a very odd pasuk, right? It says he was the most honorable among the 3, and he was for them an officer, but to the 3 he did not enter. What are we talking about? So that's what it basically means, right? I think the simple way to read this is that he did not achieve the status of the first 3. He did not compare. As great as he was, as powerful as he was, and as much as he was the officer of the second group, he did not compare to the first 3 that were mentioned, correct? Or the head of, he was Lesar, correct. But Ad HaShlosha, on the first 3, Loba, he did not achieve that status. Who else was in him in this group, in the second group of 3? Ubnayahu ben Yehoyada, Benayahu the son of Yehoyada, Ben Ishayel, who was a man of valor, incredibly brave and strong soldier. Rav Pe'alim, who performed great deeds. Mikabtze'el, who was from the place called Kabtze'el, that was the name of his location. Hu hika et shene Ariel Moav. He killed the 2 sons of Ariel of Moav. V'hu yarad v'hika et ha'ari betoch habor b'yom hashalem. And once on a snowy day, he went down into a pit and killed a lion. So these are some tough stories only because we don't really have much context of when these are happening and what the greatness of it's happening, what's going on. These are really short blurbs that the text is giving us simply to illustrate the strength and the might of some of these soldiers. Really, it appears physically, but there could also be a deeper, more metaphysical in the idea that the rabbis like to bring out, that they were strong in Torah and they grappled with lions and so on and so forth. Why might they want to mention this? I think it's simply to show the power of David's army. What this will set up for us is an interesting contrast in the next chapter when David goes to count his army and the problems that that leads to us. It could be that the text, the narrator over here, is giving us the power of his army, which is going to call into question all the more so why David needed to count his people. Look how strong his army is. Look what his soldiers are capable of accomplishing. And yet David still felt the need to count his army to know how in numbers strong they were. And that's something that David and the rest of the Jewish people will get punished for in the next chapter. So we'll hold that for a minute and see how that comes together when we get into chapter 24. Questions about this yet so far? We move further. It gives us more about his accomplishments. He also killed an Egyptian man, Ish Mar'eh, a person who was of great stature, a huge man. Ubiyad HaMitzri Chanit. In this Egyptian's man, he had a spear. Vayered elav bashavet, and he went down with it in his hand. Vayigzol et hachanit miyad HaMitzri, Benaiah went down against him with the club and wrenched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. So Benaiah had such power that he went into a battle, an engagement with an Egyptian giant, whom he was at a what's the Lord looking for? He was deficient. He didn't have the right weaponry, right? He was at a disadvantage. That's what I'm looking for. He was at a disadvantage because he had lower quality weaponry, and yet he managed to steal the weaponry out of this Egyptian man's hand and use the spear to kill him. These were the exploits and the achievements of Benaiah, son of Yehoyada. And he won a name among this group of the second group of three warriors. Again, the text tells us in verse 23, Min hashloshim nichbad, he was highly regarded among the 30. Ve'el hashlosha lo ba, but to the 3 he did not attain. Vaisimehu David el mishmato, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. So again, another cryptic pasuk, because the pasuk before told us he was amongst the second group of 3 honorable warriors. Then it says he was amongst the 30, but to the 3 he did not attain. What does that mean? So it could mean, again, he didn't attain the top 3, but it sounds like he didn't even attain the second 3, even though the previous pasuk says he did attain the second 3. So there's some internal contradictions going on over here.
And kind of like then there's 3, and then there's the.
So it's like a pyramid scheme type thing. Well, how does it solve the problem of who belongs to which group in the pyramid? Because I see where you're going. Okay. Okay. So maybe there's some doubling up. Oh, okay, I understand. Right. Okay, interesting. So you want to say maybe the shloshim over here, the highly regarded 30, were actually broken down into other smaller groups of 3. Therefore, it's possible that when it says that he wasn't a part of the 3, he wasn't a part of certain 3s, but he was a part of other 3s. Correct. That would appear that way. Well, it definitely branches them out a lot more. No question about it. I see where you're going with that. Well, what's the difference between a tribunal? In other words, what is it to? Well, they definitely have a very, I think they're really more like in typical, army fashion, you divide into units, right? You divide into units and miflagot and things like that. So it's possible that there's this hierarchy of the warrior system, who goes in what position into battle, who's the most protected people within the battle, who charges out in front, who takes the flank. I mean, there's all different types of strategy that could be involved in how you break down this army that the text isn't really giving it to us because it's not so important, but we could just imagine it kind of for ourselves. Why is it important to us is a good question. Like, why do we need to know all this? I think it really comes to highlight what we're going to see in the next chapter, which is despite all of the strength that David has, he still feels the need to count his people in numbers. And that's what I think is going to highlight a devastating mistake on the part of David. I saw here Rabbi Non Bazak also highlights another problem here, which is it calls the second category a group of 3, yet it only mentions 2 people. It only mentions Benaiah and Avishai. It doesn't give us who the third person in that group actually is. So interesting. Why not, right? Who is that third person and where did he come from? So there's a number of different approaches amongst the commentaries. Some of the commentaries say that there was a borrowed person between the top 3 and the next 2, and he actually fluctuated between these 2 groups. And so there was one person in the top 3 who also was in the bottom 3. And so really there's only 5 great warriors, but one of them keeps going between the 2. So he's counted amongst the top 3 and the middle 3. I know that sounds a little confusing. It's odd. Yeah, another point that he brings out is it's possible it's the unnamed Yoav, that Yoav belonged to this group together with his brother Avishai, but he's purposely left out because of the tension in his relationship with David. I saw here, Rabbi Avnon Bazak brings up an answer. He says, Mistaber shelefanenu shte shelashot. In front of us, we have two groups of three. Hashlosha harishonim, the first group of three, hem shloshet rashe hatzava, they're the top three in charge of the whole army. Hanimnim al pi ma'amadam, who are appointed based on their tremendous standing. He says they were Adino, Elazar, and Shama. Le'achar miken, after that, mesupar al shloshet hagiborim sheheviu et hamayim leDavid. It tells us about three unnamed soldiers who brought water to David. Eluhem hashlosha hashniya. They're really the middle three. That's really the middle three. Which are honored on their own. Except that they didn't reach the top three as well. And then Benayahu is min hashloshim nichbad el hashlosha loba. ברשימה זו נזכרים במפורש אבישי ובניהו, אך לא נאמר מיהו הגיבור השלישי, ורם יש מקום לשער שגיבור זה הוא אלעזר בן דודו. That's why I told you about the one that goes up and down. But Rabbi Amnon is saying, actually, this group of three is not a group of three on its own. It's actually a group of three that belongs with the 30. And the other group of three were those three that went and got the water, who we didn't know who their name was. And for whatever reason, the text conceals their identity from us.
Say anything else about them
Because of what they did, basically was enough. But we also don't get a name to attach to them. It's possible that they belonged in the name of one of the people we're going to see later, when it just gives us the overall list of all the warriors. We just don't know exactly who it is. So there's definitely a lot of cryptic and a lot of ambiguity here in these psukim. We can't really solve everything, but some things do become clear to us, and some things remain a question mark, a mystery. Yeah.
And I feel like now he's saying, I'm strong, it's a sign of humility. I am saying of these people who support me and meet the warrior that I am.
Yeah, I think Julie brings up a great point to answer Amy's question, that David, the narrator is saying that David is giving this credit to them and that they're worth mentioning their names because David has done so much militarily. He's had a ton of success. He's been able to do the job that Shaul wasn't able to do in getting rid of the Philistine. It's worthwhile to at least list those who have helped him during the course of this difficult journey that he's taken. What's interesting is we're about to now read a very lengthy list of all of the names of the warriors, 37 in total. In actuality, in Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, it's an even longer list. It goes even beyond 37. It adds maybe another 17 or 18 more people to get somewhere in the 50s. But here we'll see, interestingly, it cuts it at number 37, which is Uriah HaChiti, which we'll mention. Yeah. Benayahu will become an even more prominent figure in the book of Melachim because he will support Shlomo, right? And he was also mentioned, I forget where, but in certain areas of maybe supporting David in battle, in sort of passing. I think he might have been mentioned in the Avshalom battle as one of the people who helped to gather Avshalom and maybe even tell David the news about Avshalom. It's possible. I forget offhand. But he'll become an even more prominent figure as we move forward. We're up to verse 24, I believe. Yes. Also noteworthy that Benayahu becomes part of David's personal secret service, and that will seem to carry over. He'll be part of that for Shlomo as well. He's part of David's own personal bodyguard, his muscle. Verse 24, Asael achi Yoav bashloshim. Asael was among the 30 top warriors after these other groups of 3 that we've illustrated. Elchanan ben Dodo Betlehem, and so was Elchanan ben Dodo from Bethlehem. Asael, we remember, is the one who was killed by Avner ben Ner, right? When he was running away. He was the very fast one who was killed by Avner ben Ner, but at some point must have participated in some military battles with David. 25, I'm just going to read these names now. Shama ha-Harodi, Elika ha-Harodi, Cheletz ha-Palti, Ira ben Ikesh ha-Teko'i, Aviezer ha-Anetoti, Mevunai ha-Hushati, In all of these cases, the first name is his name. The second name, the E, is where he's from, is the name of the place that he's from. Hushat or Tekoa and so on. Verse 28, Salmon ha'ahohi, Mahrai ha'netofati, Helev ben Ba'ana ha'netofati, Itai ben Rivai migiv'at bene Binyamin, Benayahu par'atoni, Hidai minahale ga'ash, Avi albon ha'arbati, Azmavet ha'barhumi. Some interesting names here. El Yahba ha'sha'alboni, Bene Yashen Yehonatan. Pay attention to that one for just a moment. Bene Yashen Yehonatan sounds like what? It sounds like the sons of Yashen Yehonatan. So son sounds like plural. So even though this sounds like among the sons of Yashen was one guy, Yehonatan, it's possible that there's multiple people actually put in there. And I'll tell you in a minute why that's important. Verse 33, Shama ha-Harari, Achiam ben Sharar Harari, Elifelet ben Ahasbai ha-ben ha-Ma'achati, Eliam ben Achitofel ha-Giloni. That's a different Achitofel, I believe. I don't think it's the same Achitofel that had chased over David, although I could be wrong. I wonder. Let's see if anybody mentions anything here. I don't think so. I don't think it's the same Achitofel, just a coincidence of the name. Because I don't think Achitofel would be counted among the warriors of David. 35. Chetzrai ha-Karmeli, ha-Arai ha-Arbi, Yigaal ben Natan mitzova, Bani ha-Gadi, Selek ha-Amoni, Nahrai ha-Be'eroti, Nosek kele Yoav ben Tziruyah. There's another mention of Yoav. He was the arms bearer of Yoav ben Tziruyah. So it's almost like Yoav has been mentioned several times by way of, but actually mentioning him himself. That's definitely a point of emphasis by the narrator here. Verse 38, Ira hayitri, Garev hayitri, Uriah hachiti, Kol sheloshim v'shiv'ah. Finally, Uriah hachiti, and that wraps up 37 names of his warriors. What's very interesting is if you add up the names that were mentioned, plus the names that we had from the first two groups of three, you only end up with 36. You're actually missing one name that's not there. You add them up. Yeah. So, well, if you add in only, if you don't go in the interpretation that those, if you take in, right. So not really, because you have three, and then you also only have two, right, in the middle, right? Because we didn't count that third one. So let's assume we don't have a third one over there. And then I think there's 31 names mentioned over here, plus 5 that were mentioned on top, gives you only 36. Right. So that could be the other possibility, is that Yoav is the missing person, that's number 37. Or you can go with the Bnei Yashen interpretation that there's actually multiple people and they have to count those as 2. So the commentaries all go in this different way to try to work out the numbers. This typically happens, by the way, anytime the Tanakh or Torah lists certain people and then gives you the number, it's always never exactly the number that it is. And you have to come up with to figure out who's there. But it's specifically because whoever's writing it wants to highlight certain things about a list, right? And it kind of lulls you to sleep as you're reading. You're like, I don't recognize any of these people. Who's that? Who's that? Who's that? Who's that? And then it'll throw in a detail that it wants you to really focus in on, like the Yoav detail or the Uriah HaChiti detail. You're going to say something, Julia. Correct. You can't get away from Yoav essentially is, and it sets us up for the next chapter, because in the next chapter, David and Yoav are going to have their final fight. They're going to have the fight that really kind of tears them apart in this very tragic story that happens to the Jewish people. Is David the one authoring this? David is not necessarily the author as we put it in. No. It seems as though there's an independent narrator. And the independent narrator here stops the list at Uriah HaChiti at number 37 for a very specific reason, right? And you can't escape that reason, right? It is to say, it increases the tragedy of Uriah's death. When David sent someone to his death, he did not send a shlab. He didn't send one of these weak Nebuch Hazike soldiers out to the front lines. He sent one of his top 37 amongst hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and Uriah probably died valiantly. It's also possible that you could look at it in the reverse, that Uriah makes the list because of the fact that he went to his death in battle, so his legend sort of increased. One way or another, the narrator puts Uriah here to highlight, again, back to our original point, how central the sin of Bathsheba and that whole story is to David's life and to what he's done during the course of his reign as king and in all of the military escapades that he had. As much as he's honoring and appreciating all of his soldiers, he did make this one terrible mistake when it came to Uriah, and that's only going to lead us now into the next chapter where David once again falters and makes an error, and perhaps the error is again a compound or a purposeful error because of what he did with Bathsheba. And that's going to take us now into chapter 24. Yes. Clearly, because of the way the story shakes out, he lived close to David. Correct. And it seems as though he was well known. When David hears that Bathsheba is Uriah's wife, he doesn't say, well, like, who's that? Or whatever it is. It's clear that he's an important person. And you see, by the way, Uriah's medal, right, his moxie, when he comes to David and says, my people are on the battlefield, I will not go home and be with my wife and enjoy myself. That's part of his strength that you could definitely see there. So you get a window into his mentality, and so it's not a surprise that he makes this. We begin now chapter 24. Chapter 24 is the final episode, the final epilogue from David's tenure, and it details a very tragic story about David, but at the same time, it really does capture the whole essence of who David is and what we really take away from it, which is maybe the reason why it's the final chapter of the book of Shemuel and really the last known thing that we're going to have about David. It's, we end positively. It's all positive. It will be positive, but in true David fashion, we will not come to the positivity without a little struggle on the way. That's just the nature of David. The opening pasuk is a very difficult pasuk for the commentaries on a theological level. Let's read the pasuk. Let's read the chapter. Vayosef af Adonai laharot beYisrael. The anger of God again flared up against Israel. Vayaset et David bahem lemor. And he, being God, incited David against them, saying, Lech meneh et Israel ve'et Yehuda. Go and count the Jewish people and the tribe of Yehuda. So right away, you have to pause for a minute. There's two parts to this pasuk. The first part of the pasuk is that something angered God at the Jewish people. Rashi himself on this pasuk says he does not know what it was. The text does not give us context about what the Jewish people did to incite God's anger over here. It just says that Af Adonai, the anger of God, was upon the Jewish people, which means whatever is going to transpire in this chapter, although it seems as though it's totally David's fault, behind it is that God was already angry at the Jewish people for something, and the Jewish people were deserving of some kind of punishment. However, the tragedy is that the punishment will come to them through and because of the actions of David. The second part of the pasuk is theologically problematic. It says that God incited David, basically means that God caused David to do something wrong. What was that thing wrong? Count the people. It sounds like, as Julie says, that God took away David's free choice, a la Paro, for example, and basically forced David to perform this sin. That is a very hard thing for us to get. It's one thing when we say it about Paro, who was a Rasha, or about Sichon, or about some wicked people. For us to say that God took away David's free will and caused him to sin, and this rest of this tragedy transpires upon David as a stain on his resume, and David had no free will, is very, very troubling, very, very problematic. So much so that, for example, the Ralbag likes to say that there's a word missing here. It's not Vayaset, God enticed David. Vayaset libo et David. David's heart enticed him. Meaning that David got something in him that caused him to do this, but it was of a self-inflicting nature. What? We're going to have to talk about that. Counting people in and of itself is not bad, but we know, going back to the Torah, that anytime the Jewish people did a count, you have to count with the machatzita shekel, right? If you don't, it could be a magefa, a plague, that comes about the people. There's ayin hara that comes onto the people. That ayin hara is born out from arrogance, from ga'ava. When you count the people, especially when David wants to count his army, he wants to get a sense of the power and strength of his army. So like we said, coming off of the previous chapter, David has this all-powerful army with all these strong warriors. And really the credit goes to God. And yet despite this, he continues to fall into the trap of his own strength. And now he's going to count the people to see how many he has, to see how great his army is. And all of that is taking him ever so slightly away from God, and is going to be something God is going to punish him and the rest of the Jewish people. God is already angry at the Jewish people, but God can choose to punish the Jewish people on his own if he wants to. The fact that he does it through David because of David's actions holds David accountable for that. He enticed David to do something wrong so that David could do it wrong and he could bring the punishment. That's what it sounds like. The problem is it ever so slightly sounds like he took away David's free will, which we don't want to say. So that's one idea. Another possibility is that we have to read from the end of last chapter into this chapter. That the end of last chapter is again a reminder of the sin of Bathsheba. And the sin of Bathsheba has continuously snowballed into other errors that David has made. And so this is another compound of punishment towards the sin of Bathsheba, is another possibility. And we were just counting. Yeah. In other words, so the idea of counting is already on David's mind. We're counting, but the text can do what it wants. The text is enumerating, but then the text is saying, yes. Yes, the problem is, did you count though in actuality? The text can do what it wants. The text can tell you. But it is ironic that the text is counting and then saying, despite this count, David still counted. David went and physically counted. That was towards an appreciation for them. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. It's a show of putting a little bit more in your court and not enough in Hashem's court. So look at Yoav's reaction to this. Verse 2. Vayomer HaMelech el Yoav, the king says to Yoav, Sar HaChayil Asher Ito, the tremendous commander that he had with him, Shutna bechol shivtei Yisrael, make your rounds towards all of the tribes of Israel, Midan ve'ad Be'er Sheva, from Be'er Sheva in the south to Dan in the north, Ufikdu et ha'am, and take a census of the people, V'yada'ati et mispar ha'am, and I will therefore know the number of people that I have. Yoav is hesitant, and he warns the king. Verse 3. Vayomer Yoav el HaMelech, Yoav says to the king, V'yosef Adonai alecha el ha'am kahem v'chahem me'ah pe'amim. May God increase the number of the people 100-fold. Ve'enei Adonai HaMelech ra'ot. The eyes of the king, you see it. In other words, the growth is palpable, right? We don't need to get an exact number, Yoav is saying. Everybody's aware as you just take a look, do the eye test, you can see that our population is bursting. V'Adoni HaMelech, my lord the king, lama hafetz badavar hazeh. Why do you desire this matter? Yoav is trying to talk David out of it and saying, Hashem will bless you. There's no need to count it. You don't have to have an exact number. Just look around. We don't exactly know. So it's good. You're bringing up Yoav in the doghouse. It's like, we don't have a context as to when exactly this did happen. It's possible it happened at the very end. It's possible that this happened in the interim during some other stories at times when David and Yoav were a little bit more on board. We've seen tension between David and Yoav in the Absalom story and in other stories, but we've never seen Yoav totally abandon David as he will at the beginning of Melachim. That's something else. So there's always been Yoav together with David, although he's been doing a lot of suspicious things in David's eyes, and there's always been this tension between the two of them. David was, and he's going to put it to Yoav. I don't know that he's trying to set Yoav up in this situation. He wants Yoav to take it out. Yoav is the foil. Remember, we've always looked at David. He's always the foil. When David's doing good, Yoav seems to be falling. When David's doing bad, Yoav is the one who comes out good. So here's where Yoav is the positive foil to David. He's trying to talk David out of this very bad plot. Yeah. So he says, verse 4, "Vayehezak devar hamelech el Yoav." The king intensifies his demand towards Yoav. He stays strong. Ve'al sareh hechayil, and on the officers of the army. And so Yoav has no choice. Vayetze Yoav v'sareh hachayil lifnei hamelech. Yoav goes out together with his officers before the king, lifkod et ha'am et Israel, to count the people. But you could see he's dragging his feet. He's not happy about it. How do we also know he's dragging his feet? In a moment, we'll see how long it took him to do the census, right? It's going to take him a lot longer than we once thought. Yeah, we surely should have. That wasn't part of the command. The rabbis somewhat debate how come David didn't know this, right? It's a clear decree inside of the Torah. It's a clear mitzvah in the Torah. David is not an ignorant person. He knows the law in the Torah. So the commentaries, so that maybe he didn't have to say it. Yoav should know to do it. Why didn't they do it? I don't think that the Mahatzita Shekel would have helped in this situation, to be honest. It's true the Mahatzita Shekel saves you from that, but the Mahatzita Shekel has a particular time and place. So some commentaries say God made him forget it. That's kind of the Vayaset David, the kind of the part that God took around. When David made this mistake, God made him make some very foolish mistakes, things that David should know. He caused him to forget. Others suggest that the Mahatzita Shekel only works in certain contexts, and the context that David wanted to do it in, the Mahatzita Shekel wouldn't have helped. Just the act of counting, even with the Mahatzita Shekel, was wrong in this context. It's possible he used the Mahatzita Shekel here, but it was still a problem. He shouldn't have counted in that context. You want to count towards the Beit HaMikdash, you want to count towards something else. Stam, out of nowhere to take a census, even with the Mahatzita Shekel, David had no place doing it. That's another argument. We don't know. It's not clear, but I'll go with this. If Rashi tells you, and Rashi on the first pasuk, Rashi says, Lo yadati Allah. Rashi says, I don't know why God got angry. So if he didn't know why they got angry, I don't know. It's speculative. I'm leaving it as speculation. For whatever reason, the text doesn't want to reveal it to us. Yeah. I think that counting by number specifically, like giving that, like whatever it is, right? I would think when they're in front of you and you're doing a 1, 2, 3, 4 type counting, that's something that they say to take to stay away from, right? And the idea. Yeah, okay, you can say it like that. I think in that context, the person has a utilitarian purpose for it. What we're really talking about is when a person is going to number their children for the possibility of arrogance. Wow, honey, we have 20 grandchildren. We have 22 grandchildren. When a person is kind of taking stock of things, which can give them a big head, and now you're counting for that purpose, that's what David is doing here, and that's what we want to stay away from. More specific. Exactly. So that's why I don't think there's superstition involved over here. I think this is a real thing. The ayin hara comes, what we're talking about here is ayin hara, it comes from arrogance. And so when a person is taking stock of what they have to sort of feel pride and arrogance and greatness about themselves, that's where the danger is. I want to set my table and I need to know how many chairs I need. I don't think it's fine in that situation. You want to figure it out. But when a person is just sitting there and talking to their friend over lunch and you're like, wow, amazing. Hashem is so great. I have 25 grandchildren, and then start counting. That's where you have to take a step back. And a person's that's where the Bili Ayin Hara comes. A person's putting out things into the world that can give them a little bit of a big head. And that's where you want to try to stay away from. Even still, one has to be still reserved about how they do it, especially when you're putting it out to other people as well. Yeah. Verse 5. ויעברו את הירדן ויחנו בערוער ימין העיר אשר בתוך הנחל הגד ואל יעזר. They crossed the Jordan and encamped at Aroer, because now they're going to start by counting the Jewish people on the other side of the Jordan River, right? Asher betoch hanachal, on the right side of the town, which is in the middle of the Wadi of Gad, and went on to Ya'azer. Vayavo ha-Gil'ada, they then go to Gil'ad, ve'el eretz tachtim chodshi, vayavo dana ya'ar v'saviv el Tzidon. They continued to Gil'ad and to the region of Tahtim Chodshi, and they came to Dan Ya'an and around to Tzidon. So they're mapping out how they're going. They went onto the fortress of Tyre, and all the towns of the Chivites and Canaanites, and then they find their way down south in the Judean part of Be'er Sheva. They traversed the whole country. And then they came back to Yerushalayim at the end of 9 months and 20 days. That is a very long time to go about counting the people. Who knows? I'm sure to a degree, but definitely the reason for mentioning this long-winded account of how they did the count and how long it took only adds more issues to this, right? It basically shows us that Yoav took his time doing it because he was dragging his feet. And it also tells us that it gave more time for David to recant, to cancel it, and he continued to allow it to go on. So there was a time gap in which David had the ability to pull back, and he did not do it. Additionally, Rav Bazak points out over here that it seems 2 tribes did not really get counted. Based on the way the map kind of works out, 2 tribes get left out. Anybody can sense which 2 tribes got left out of the count? Levi is one tribe that seems to get left out, and that's for a very distinct purpose because Levi is never counted together with the rest of the people. They always get a separate count. They don't go into that. Scattered amongst don't have their own land. They always have a different one. What was the other tribe somebody said? Binyamin. Yehuda definitely gets counted. Binyamin doesn't seem to get counted. Possibly because Binyamin resides mostly in the city of Yerushalayim, so they're very close to the king, so maybe they didn't need an exact figure. Also, Rav Bazak posits that maybe because Yoav sensed that danger was going to come as a result of this, he did not want to count the tribe of Binyamin. He did not want the tribe of Binyamin to suffer the consequences of the census. Why not? Because they were already devastated in the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah, all the way back to that terrible story at the end of the book of Shoftim, when basically the tribe of Binyamin came to the brink of extinction, almost total wipeout from the rest of the Jewish people. They're still, even this many years later, recovering their population after almost totally being wiped out. So Yoav said, I'm staying away from the tribe of Binyamin. They cannot suffer another devastating loss, which is what the rest of the Jewish people do in fact suffer from. Verse 9, Vayiten Yoav et mispar mifkad ha'am el hamelech. Yoav brings back the number from the nation to the king. Vatehi Yisrael shemone me'ot elef. The Jewish people number 800,000 ish chayil, soldiers. Sholef cherev, who have drawn swords. The ish Yehuda, and among those, the men of Yehuda, 500,000 ish. They numbered 500,000 people. This is by far the largest total we have ever seen in any census of the Jewish people, right? 800,000 soldiers, right? And among them, 500,000 for Yehuda. To give us perspective, when Shaul got a number, and he didn't do a census, but the text gives us a number, they were 300,000 soldiers and 50,000 from the tribe of Yehuda. So the tribe of Yehuda has almost increased by an exponent of 10, 50,000 to 500,000. And the Jewish people, the soldiers in general, from 300,000 to 800,000, and that's just soldiers. That's just army men. Forget about the population. So there's a tremendous boom from the time of Shaul to the time of David. And Yoav knew this. Yoav told David, you could just see it with your own eyes, but David needs the number. Yoav gives him the number, and now the consequences will be. I don't know if I have to take it at face value that it's accurate. It could be definitely people came and wanted to marry in, and the population grew, and David's, benefits that he gives to his own tribe, possible. The tribe of Yehuda has always been the most numerous and most powerful among the tribes, but never to this disparity. For example, in the desert, they were 74,000 out of 600,000 plus, right? Which is a little more than 10%. This time it's 500,000 out of 800,000. It's more than 50%. The ratios are totally skewed in that favor. I believe it's out of. I think it's out of. It doesn't. Yeah. Chronicles is Divrei Hayamim has a different number, right? What does it say over there?
It says 1,100,000 for Israel and 470,000 for Yehudah.
Yeah.
Figures which refer only to men of military age imply a total population of 5 or 6 million. A high but not impossible population by the extreme fertility of the.
So I think I'm wrong. I think the 500,000 is in addition to the other 800,000. It's not out of, it's in addition to. But still, even still, the ratio is quite off, because then it's 500,000 out of 1.3 million, right? So is a little is less than half. It's maybe 40% almost, right? As opposed to 74, right? And you're saying it can be totaled even with people. That's 1.3 million soldiers, somewhere in the 5 to 6 million in terms of the full population. So there's no question that they experienced a tremendous population increase and boom over the course of David's tenure, the likes of which we maybe have not seen any other time in history, right? Yeah, it's a massive increase. Yeah, it's a massive increase for sure. Not an impossible increase, but high. And that can only it's 480 years in Shlomo's time from Yetziat Mitzrayim. So we're probably in the 450, 460 year range since Yetziat Mitzrayim. So we expect an increase, but it seems as though this gives us the impression that God blessed the kingdom tremendously during the time of David, right? Which fits. Now, the irony is what are we going to have? After counting this massive population, it's going to bring a what? A plague, which is going to kill a lot of people. Right away, verse 10, Vayach lev David oto aharechen safar et ha'am. Right afterward, David his heart is hit, his heart is weakened. In other words, right after it's all over, he realizes immediately what he did wrong, right? This text portrays it as David came to the realization on his own that he had erred. In Divrei Hayamim and Chronicles, it sounds a little bit more like God started the punishment and then David realized. So a little bit of a different account in each spot. But one way or another, David recognizes very fast what he did wrong. And that's typical David fashion. He realizes very early on when he made a mistake. Vayomer David el Adonai, David says to God, Hatati me'od asher asiti. I sinned greatly with that which I did. Ve'ata Adonai, and now God, ha'averna et avon avdecha, ki niskalti me'od. Please forgo on my sin, on the sin of your servant, for I have acted incredibly foolish. Verse 11, Vayakom David baboker, David wakes up in the morning, Udvar Adonai haya el Gad hanavi chozeh David lemor. And the word of God came to David through his Navi, his prophet at the time, and a man by the name of Gad. What does God tell him? He says, Haloch v'dibarta el David. Go, God tells Gad, go and speak to David the following words. Ko amar Adonai. This is what God has said. Shalosh ani notel alecha. 3 punishments I give before you. Behar lecha ahat mehem ve'eselach. Choose one of your 3 punishments, and that's the thing that I will bring upon you. Fascinating. This is the first time, we have no precedent for something like this, where God presents 3 options of a punishment and asks David to pick the one. This may very well be a test in and of itself. The question is, did David pass the test or not? And it will not be clear right away. So let's read the 3 punishments. Verse 13, Vayavo Gad el David. God comes to David, Vayaged lo, and he says to him, Vayomer lo, he says, Hatavo lecha sheva shanim ra'av be'artzecha. Will you choose for 7 years of famine in your land? Im shlosha chodashim nusecha lifnei tzarecha vehu rodefecha. Or 3 months of you having to run from your enemies while your enemies are chasing you. Ve'im heyot sheloshet yamim dever be'artzecha. Or 3 days of pestilence in your land. So choose 7 years of famine, 3 months of military defeat, of running away from your enemies, or 3 days of pestilence amongst your people. Clearly, the timelines of the punishment are different, based on the severity. Ra'av doesn't guarantee death, it's just famine. So therefore 7 years. Running away from your enemies is incredibly difficult and dangerous and disgraceful. So it's 3 months. And David is the most severe of all of them, hence it's only 3 days. So what will you take? Let me just finish the pasuk. He says, Ata da'ur'eh. Now you must know and see. Ma ashiv sholhi davar. Consider carefully what reply I shall take back to him who sent me. So already in God's words, you see he's telling him, think long and hard about this. This is not a simple decision. And part of your legacy rests upon this decision to make. You think it's very simple? What would you choose? Why?
Because 7 years of famine affects the entire nation.
Right?
And the pestilence also affects the entire nation. That's the food supply, the pestilence comes and eats everything. This is mostly on him.
So Esther says that the punishment, the middle punishment, which is him running away, which David could have interpreted is not just him, it's also his military, it's his army, it's other people. I think that's what was going through David's mind. But it's true that it's the one that's mentioned in the singular, Nusecha, you will run, Lifnet Sarecha, before your enemies, and he will chase you. David probably understood that to mean his whole army, but I will try to bring some support to your idea. I will try to bring some support. Julie had something to say. 3 days, get it over with. Choose the timeline that's the shortest. Do you think the same number of people are going to die no matter what? It's not clear. That's what David has to kind of read between the lines and try to understand what's happening. We don't know. We don't know. Right? If that's the case, if that is the case, though, then I think the purpose of these punishments is that they'll ultimately balance each other out. I think the length of 7 years of famine means that less people will die. The severity of the punishment will be in the suffering that they will ensue, not the death, as opposed to a shorter punishment with more death, but that they will be able to recover from a little bit quicker. So I don't think personally that the same number of people would die in the plague as in the famine. Otherwise, it's obviously great that he didn't choose the famine, which he's not going to choose, right? All of it is possible, but it seems as though God will manipulate the circumstances so that everything comes out in something of an equal term. Something of an equal term. It really depends on who will suffer the brunt of the punishment and how long and how stretched will that suffering be is really the question.
And also the king is on the run, that's really hard for anything.
Okay, so you think that the one on the run is the hardest one to kind of endure? Well, then it makes a lot of sense. It's no wonder that basically, let's see David's response, because his answer is interesting because David chooses but doesn't really choose. Watch what happens. I don't think we're going to get to finish it because we're running out of time. I'll just read one more pasuk and we'll see. Verse 14, David says, Vayomer David el Gad. David says to God, Tsar li me'od, I'm in great distress. So first thing he tells us is, this is a really hard decision. I don't know what to do. But he does come up with one idea. He says, Nipelana biyad Adonai, I would rather fall into the hands of God, Hirabim rahamav, because God's mercy is great, Uvyad Adam al epola, and in the hands of man, I shall not fall. What is David's answer? Does he choose? So he chooses but doesn't choose. He basically eliminates choice number 2. That's basically what he does. He says, I cannot bear to have myself fall into the hands of the enemy. And this is maybe to Amy's point about the trauma that David has had over the course of his life and being in the enemy. But I also think David looks at the enemy as his worst bet because he cannot control the enemy. The enemy does not have rahmanut on him, right? And so therefore he says, I'd rather be in the hands of God, whom I can appeal to God's mercy, and I could try to do teshuvah, and I could try to pray, and I could try to reverse the decree, as opposed to once it's in the hands of the enemy, I'm in their hands. I cannot do anything about it. My mercy is limited. So David says, I don't by any circumstances want number 2, but he doesn't make a choice between 1 and 3, because famine is in the hands of God, as well as pestilence is in the hands of God. It seems as though he leaves it up to God to choose between 1 and 3. He just doesn't want to be in choice number 2. So that is another element. You could say that that Ra'av does have a human component in the sense that it affects the people the most, and you need to rely on other people. And right. So if you do compare between Ra'av and Dever is more of the godly punishment than Ra'av maybe is, which comes from God, but then has an impact on the people. Yeah. So that is what God ultimately brings. God does bring the Dever, and they do rely on God's mercy. And that's what the rest of the chapter is going to bring. The questions that we remain unanswered is, how does the rest of the chapter tell us whether David made the right decision or the wrong decision? Is David right for what he did? Is he wrong for what he did? How does David respond? How does he get out of this problem? Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to have to remain on a little bit of a cliffhanger, see how the rest of the punishment sort of plays out and how David responds to it. There's a nice uplifting story at the end of the chapter, at least by which we see something of the character of David before we move into the book of Melachim. So I hope for us, our sake, that we can, because the last couple of classes we keep ending in the middle of the chapter, we're kind of off. But at least for one sake, we'll be able to finish and then hopefully finish the first chapter of the book of Melachim if we can, so we can get back on a chapter by chapter. But the truth is we're all together in it, so we'll have to wait just one more week before we conclude the book. Huh? So the question is that the right thing to do? Did David choose the right punishment? Should he have maybe taken, some here arguing that the punishment of number 2, which he rejected of the enemy, was the punishment for him, as opposed to David and Ra'av were the punishments for everybody else. So maybe that's wrong. So we have to kind of play both sides. How does it do that? Right. So you're saying the enemies are the sinners or the Jewish people are the sinners? Oh. That has a bad blood with the Jewish people or something like that? I thought you were going to say that when people are in a warlike situation, maybe they don't behave so well. They start to do things. Okay, I see that. I think also God could have brought an enemy who's already been a thorn in the side of the Jewish people to that point, which would not have increased the tension in any way. But once God brings them, that's kind of like what it is. Okay, we have what to try and work through Be'ezrat Hashem at the end of 24 and moving into chapter 1 of Melachim. Have a great day, everybody.